housekeeping items. Please leave your microphones off and your webcams off for the time being as the opportunity comes up to ask questions. Please type them into the chat box. We can offer the opportunity to unmute your microphone and ask the question verbally if you wish. We will do that and moderate that for you. I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce Dr. Sari Kraft. Dr. Kraft is a family physician practicing sport and exercise medicine. In addition to her role as at the Athletics Canada East Training Hub as the physician there, she provides performance coverage for the National Ballet of Canada and is part of the integrated support team for the Canadian National Trampoline Team. She was the lead medical doctor for the gymnastics venue at the 2015 Pan Am Games and was a member of the core medical team for the Canadian delegation at the 2017 World University Games and at the 2017 and 2019 Canada Games. So I would like to pass over to Dr. Sari to continue introducing yourself if you wish, Dr. Sari. We have your slides, your deck on the screen ready to go. So without further ado, please take it away.
Okay, thanks. And thanks everyone for joining. And thanks also for sending in all those great questions in advance. I've been working hard trying to find the answers for you. And I'll start off, I know we've already had a presentation about the legislation about stage 2 of phase 2. And I was all set to gloss over that quickly, and then everything really changed on Monday. So we'll go over a little bit of that and a bit about the risk assessment tool. And then I'll try to get right into your questions. And just a little disclaimer, I am a doctor, I'm not a lawyer or a legislator. So a lot of the things we'll talk about are sort of open to interpretation, and we are trying to get clarification for you. But I haven't written any of the laws or the documents that we're talking about. So I still have some questions and clarifications about them, but we'll try to work through them as best we can. So first off, and all the talk about the phases and the stages, this is what Ontario has come up with in terms of how we're gradually reopening. So right now we're in phase 2, which has 3 stages. So we're all currently in stage 2 of phase 2. 24 public health units. So a lot of the province has been in stage 2 since June 12th. And then Toronto, Peel, and Windsor joined that about 2 weeks after that. And then Leamington and Kingsville were the latest ones on July 8th. And then we just heard on Monday that we're actually, a lot of the province is moving into stage 3 of phase 2 as of midnight tonight. And that's most of the province except for the GTA, Hamilton, Niagara, Windsor, Lambton, Alderman, Norfolk. So basically the ones that joined stage 2 later, we're still in stage 2 for now. We're not sure exactly when we'll be moving forward, but that will depend on if we continue to have a decrease in our numbers of cases, and if everything continues to go well, hopefully we'll be joining soon. So this is a quick kind of review of what Doug Richards had talked about in phase 2. So those of us who are still in phase 2, all indoor facilities are closed unless they're NSO, PSO, or a professional sport league. There's still a 2-meter distancing in place, and team sports aren't allowed except for training, and there's no games or scrimmages allowed. And then locker rooms, change rooms, showers, etc. are closed. And any equipment must be cleaned or disinfected between each use. And if you have equipment or fixed structures that you can't clean or disinfect, then you're not allowed to use them. And pools had their whole separate category for stage 2. So as far as the pools go in stage 2, there's no climbing structures allowed, so no slides or diving boards. Distancing has to be maintained, equipment has to be disinfected, and locker rooms and change rooms are open, but they have to be cleaned and disinfected frequently. So this is where we've all been, at least for the last week or so, if not longer, in different areas of the province. So the next step is stage 3 of phase 2. This is a page of a document that outlines all the details. That bottom link is the one where you can find it. If you just Google Ontario Stage 3, it'll come up. And it's a little more user-friendly than the legislative wording. It gives actually a bit more detail, and it has some information that's not in the legislation. And the actual legislation, it's Regulation 36420, and that first link there is where you can find it. So some of the highlights of that are the gathering limits are going up quite a bit. Right now in Stage 2, the gathering limit is 10. And for Stage 3, it's going to go up to 50. But that depends on room capacity and the ability to distance. So if you have a facility where you can only have 20 people to maintain that 2-meter distancing, then you can't add extra people if you can't maintain distancing. And the outdoor limit will be 100. But you can't kind of use both. So if you have, if you're hosting something that's indoor and outdoor, you can't go up to 150. If part of it's indoor, you still have to stick to that 50. And the distancing applies unless you're in the same household or the same social circle. So social circle is something that came up in Stage 2 as well. That hasn't changed, but if you're within the same social circle, then you don't have to distance. So for Stage 3, for sport and recreation facilities, so it still does say that you should be physical distancing, but there is an exception that if you're playing a team sport, or if needed for personal training, and the personal training part is not in the legislation, but it's in that Ontario document. The gathering limits don't apply to certain areas like pools, tennis courts, or rinks, but they do apply to any indoor facilities. We still have to clean and disinfect equipment. Now, washrooms and locker rooms are allowed to be open as long as they're cleaned and disinfected. Steam rooms and saunas are still closed. And in terms of the pools, they had specifically excluded diving boards in Stage 2. They don't mention them in Stage 3, but they do say that water slides may be open. So depending how you interpret that, I would think if a water slide is open, a diving board can be open, but they don't specifically mention it in Stage 3. So for team sports and sport events, this is some vague language that we've been, some of my colleagues and I were trying to interpret to figure out what exactly is allowed. But basically, you're not allowed to have any prolonged or deliberate contact. And that's not really defined, but they do specifically say in that Ontario document that team sports in which body contact between players is either an integral component of the sport or commonly occurs while engaged in the sport, and they gave the examples of wrestling and judo, are not yet permitted unless you can modify the approach to prevent prolonged or deliberate physical contact. I realize wrestling and judo aren't team sports, but this is directly from that Ontario document. So anything where you have to make body contact to actually do the sport is not yet allowed. And they are allowing some spectators, but they're still subject to the gathering limits and physical distancing measures. And there's a new section in the Stage 3 legislation that talks about teaching and instruction. And there's not a comprehensive list of what this would include. They do specifically mention teaching music, teaching language. They use kind of the vague term recreational instruction. But in there, it says that you have to maintain 2-meter distancing except where necessary for teaching and instruction that cannot be effectively provided if physical distancing is maintained. So again, when I read this and with my colleagues, when we read this through, we thought this could apply to instruction in sport or physical activity. It's not specifically mentioned, but coaching is a form of instruction. And in those situations, if you do have to get closer than 2 meters, then they do recommend a face covering if possible, and you still have to follow the gathering limits as well. So in terms of the risk mitigation or assessment or planning, this is the tool through On the Podium. We do have this on the CSIO resource website, and there's a whole slide deck about how to use it. but I'll go through it a little bit quickly just so we can review it. This one is designed for NSOs, but depending on the situation with the PSOs, it might be applicable. There's also a club risk assessment tool that's designed a bit more for community clubs. So you can take a look at both and see which one meets your needs best or is most applicable, but they're quite similar and the idea is the same. So the first part of the risk assessment is 6 questions, and each of them are weighted equally. And really with these, you don't have too much control. So the first question is, will the training be held in a region that has documented active local transmission of COVID-19 in the last 14 days? So that's something we can't really change, but it does really affect the risk for your program. And then will the training be held in venues or facilities with access by multiple groups? Will the group include team members relocating from areas that have documented active local transmission? And will the group include people who are at higher risk of severe disease? Is the training at higher risk, like a contact sport or shared equipment? And will the training be held indoors? And then based on this, you get a score from 0 to 6. So if it's 0, the risk is quite negligible, and really the rest of the tool doesn't matter so much. But if you have a score of 6, the risk is very high, and really, no matter what you do, it's still going to be very high. So the next part is a mitigation checklist. So it goes into a lot of detail. It asks very specific questions about whether you have a plan in place to make sure everyone knows about COVID and preventing spread. It asks about specific measures, response plans, whether you can isolate. So if someone does have symptoms, or if there's a positive test, or someone in a training group comes down with something, can you isolate them from the rest of the group? And a lot of coordination, communication. So if you go through the list, it takes a lot of work to get through, but if you go through it, you'll have considered most of the different ways that you can prevent the spread and be as safe as possible. And then once you get through that, you end up with a final risk assessment. So if you look on the left side here, that's the answers to those first 6 questions. And what you'll see and what I was talking about is if you have 4 or more of positive answers to those questions, your risk is pretty high. And even if you have all your mitigation procedures in place, the best you can do, like if you had a score of 4, is moderate risk. But if if you have 1 to 3 positive answers, then your mitigation strategies make a big difference, because you could go from the moderate risk all the way down to the low risk. And this is just the first page of that, the club risk assessment tool. So again, it's quite similar. And if you haven't already, you can download them. There's links through the CSIO website as well. So now we'll get to some of the questions. So, like I said, we had a lot of really good questions. So hopefully this will be useful for you. So the first question we'll go over is, how do the Ontario Public Health requirements apply to university sport as well as provincial sports? And I had written all these answers over the weekend, and then on Monday everything changed. So a lot of these have 2 answers depending what stage your area is in. So for stage 2, for anything outdoors or for pools, there's no specific affiliation required. So if it's a university outdoor sport and you're following the guidelines for outdoors, that's fine. Indoors, there were those exceptions that I mentioned for PSOs, NSOs, and pro sports. They didn't specifically mention university sports. So for indoor, my interpretation of the legislation is you can do your indoor training with modification if you're part of a PSO, but not necessarily if it's a university sport. And stage 3 opens things up a lot more. So that allows indoor sport and recreation facilities, again, no affiliation required. So as long as you are following all the requirements and you're avoiding that prolonged or deliberate contact and following the gathering limits, then that would be allowed. So this was a diving specific question, but I have a feeling other sports would have similar questions. So this question was about coaching sessions or learning to dive sessions, and coaches needing to be closer, not social distance, and make contact with an athlete. So again, with stage 2, that specifically excluded diving boards, so that really gets in the way of diving training. And it still emphasized that you have to comply with physical distancing requirements. And the nice thing with a lot of sports, if you haven't already checked your NSO websites, a lot of them have actually come up with sport-specific return to training guidelines for COVID. So these are really useful because there's lots of different sports and equipment and specifics of training. So I pulled up the diving ones. They actually have quite a comprehensive plan there. And they had initially said that spotting athletes won't be allowed unless special permission is given by local public health authorities. So Ontario has not specifically said, yes, you can spot while diving. Again, with the instruction part of stage 3, I think that could be interpreted as you can spot if needed, because if you have to, and the only way to teach or instruct what you need to do is to make contact, it would be allowed. But you would still want to limit that as much as possible. And Diving Canada they had specifically talked about using harnesses, and ideally the divers can safely secure their own, but if needed, the coach can assist while wearing protective clothing. They didn't specifically say what protective clothing, but we can talk about that. And then in stage 3, again, I interpreted that as they didn't specifically mention diving boards. Slides are allowed, so I'm assuming that they can open. And you can contact as needed for personal training or when necessary. So as much as you can do without being within 2 meters, you should do. If you have to be closer, then you'd want to consider all of your mitigation strategies. So through that whole tool, it talks about screening everyone for symptoms before they come in, making sure everyone who's coming in is at low risk. And then before any contact, you'd want to make sure you're washing your hands, and ideally wearing a face covering, especially if you're going to be close or face to face. So this was another good question. I'm not sure I have a perfect answer, but what are the best practices for safely ensuring athletes are tracking their symptoms on a daily basis and creating buy-in to those who may be skeptical? That's a question we always have in medicine. How do we get people to buy into what we're recommending? If you have a really great idea, that might be very helpful to share with all of us. But I would say it really depends. It depends on how many athletes you're trying to keep track of and what your needs are and what resources are available. What we've done in athletics is it's mandatory. So we don't let you into the hub to train if you haven't filled out your symptom score. And if you forgot, then we have it all on paper, and everyone they actually have to sign an attestation saying that they understand that they have to report any symptoms and they haven't been in contact with anyone. And I think several other sports have done this too. So that might be the most effective way, that you're not allowed to come and train unless you've done it. We also try to educate everyone, because it's hard to buy into something if you don't understand why. So some people might think, COVID's not a big deal. Younger athletic people might not get as severe complications, although we know it is possible. One of the things we emphasized a little bit is the inconvenience factor, that if one person gets symptoms or if someone tests positive, everyone they've been in contact with has to be tested and quarantined. So, if you're responsible for the whole training group getting quarantined for 14 days, that's really no fun and it doesn't feel great. So, even if you just have the sniffles and you pass it on to someone else, now they have to get tested and they have to quarantine while they're waiting for the results. And if they pass it on to someone else, it's a whole chain of lots of people going through a lot of inconvenience. In terms of tools, again, it depends a bit what you have available. Ideally, they would screen, fill out all the symptoms and exposure and travel questions before they even come, because what you want is anyone with symptoms or who's at risk to realize that before they show up at your facility so they don't expose anyone else, and so that you can flag that and make sure it's managed properly. Google Sheets have been quite popular. I know one of the clinics I work at just created a Google Sheet. We have to fill it out within the 2 hours before we go into work. They keep track of that. It's a quick, yes or no question, and then you go in. At athletics, we use Smartabase. You could do it on paper. They could have an attestation, or they can sign a form. I know some apps, one of the ones that I think Athletics Ontario uses for registration has added a symptom tracking and attendance tracking function. I don't know the details about it, but if you are using any registration software, any apps, it's probably worth contacting the app or the software to see if they have something like that. But again, it really depends on what resources you have. I put a picture up here of the government app and symptom tracker. This is the one that we were told was going to be able to do Bluetooth contact tracing on July 2nd, but I keep checking it, and it doesn't seem like I can activate the contact tracing yet. I think they're working on it, but that's something to keep an eye on as well. All right, and this was about sort of sports specific. Being an outdoor individual winter sport, what are your suggestions with respect to the management of competitions and time trials in the dryland season and into the winter? So I wasn't sure exactly which sport this came from, but again, I looked up the NSO guidelines for all the outdoor individual winter sports, and I found two, and biathlon actually had the most detail about it. And it was similar to Nordic actually. So these were their recommendations. They said individual start only, race entries are limited in order to respect physical distancing and are in line with maximum outdoor group gathering size. Timing chips aren't used, either self-timed or timed by the coach using a stopwatch, and no shared bibs. So again, with any races or competitions where there's going to be a lot of athletes together, you do as much as you can to distance as much as possible. So in stage 3, there is that sort of caveat that if you're playing a sport, you can get closer than the 2 meters. But again, you'd want to limit that as much as possible. If it's a sport where people are going to be passing each other, ideally the trail or the track is wide enough that there's some space to do that. And you'd want to limit how many athletes there are to avoid huge groups of people. Okay, and then there was a question on testing, which I know comes up a lot. So this was about testing for training camps, if you're doing it before or at the start or during or after the camp. And they noticed that the sport medicine groups aren't recommending testing for asymptomatic people, but many teams are operating differently. If you've looked at anything going on in the States, a lot of competitions are requiring testing. A lot of the pro leagues are testing people every other day. But this is the guideline from the Sport Medicine Advisory Committee. It was actually just updated yesterday. So the more recent update before that was on June 30th. But they still don't recommend routine testing of asymptomatic individuals. You can find these updates, again, on the CSIO website, or you may already be receiving emails. But there's a few reasons why we're not currently recommending asymptomatic testing. And we'll just go over those. So there are quite a few pitfalls of testing. It's not perfect. The current test that's approved in Canada is called a PCR test. It's when you put a very long Q-tip, it's kind of that long, into the nose. It goes quite far back, and you swab way at the back of the nose and then check for virus RNA. But even if it's done properly, there's about a 20 to 30% false negative rate. So that means 20 to 30% of negative tests people might actually still have COVID, and there's a few reasons for that. So if you have been exposed, like if public health calls you and says you've had close contact with someone who tested positive, they will recommend a test, but even if the test's negative, they'll still recommend a 14-day quarantine. And that's because the virus has an incubation period up to a maximum of 14 days. The average is 5 days. But in those first few days when the virus is replicating, you might not have enough to show up as a positive test. And if you don't have symptoms, the risk of a false negative test is even higher. So it doesn't really change things if you've been exposed. You still have to quarantine the 14 days. A positive test would just help with contact tracing for other people. And then the other issue is if you do test positive and you want to keep testing even after symptoms have gone away, sometimes the test stays positive because you still have pieces of the virus, but they might not actually be infectious anymore. And then if you're looking for the test to clear someone, they might be stuck out of sport for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, when really they didn't pose a risk to anyone else because their symptoms had gone away. The other thing is if you're traveling, other regions and countries have different testing procedures. So there are different types of tests available in different areas. They all have different levels of accuracy. They may be more or less accessible depending where you are, and some of them can get really expensive. And the other thing is to remember, testing really isn't the be-all and end-all. The most important thing is monitoring everyone for symptoms, maintaining your physical distancing, following proper hand hygiene, respiratory etiquette, and wearing masks. So it's not that testing is bad, it's just it can give you a false sense of security, or you can get stuck chasing down a persistent positive test. So it's one tool, but these are some of the reasons why we don't recommend just testing everyone who doesn't have any symptoms. So as far as what Ontario recommends, if you go to covid-19.ontario.ca, they tell you when you should be getting a test. And you can actually do a self-assessment as well. So it goes through all the symptoms and risk factors and exposures, and it can tell you if a test is recommended. So currently, we do recommend that if you're worried about having COVID-19 or you think you've been exposed to it, you should get tested. Definitely if you have any symptoms, and there's a long list now, it's available on the provincial website. And they're also advertising, but if you're at risk based on where you work, like if you work in a daycare or you're a healthcare worker. But there's not really any guidance of how frequently should you get tested, because you might test negative today and then tomorrow you get exposed. They do also have the caveat, if you want to test, yes, you are able to get it. So that leads to our next question, which was, if we still want to get a test, is there a way to organize this in the Ontario health system for our team? And the short answer is yes. In Ontario, it's easy. Other provinces are a bit different. Some of them don't test anyone without symptoms. But if you go to that same website, covid-19.ontario.ca, this will pop up. And if you go right where I've circled in red, you can click Find an Assessment Center. And it has all the assessment centers searchable by location. It has their contact information, whether you need to make an appointment. Some of them require a self-assessment first. It's all OHIP covered, so it is quite easy. If you're traveling with a team somewhere else, then you would have to check their local regulations. This question, I feel like I need a crystal ball to answer it. When do you feel it will be safe for closer contact than the 2-meter social distance? So that's really hard to answer. Right now, it's safe if you're in the same household or in the same social circle. For stage 2, most of the legislation and guidance is really that everyone should be maintaining that 2-meter distance. But stage 3 allows for some exceptions, as I had talked about. So that instruction or teaching exception, playing a sport, you can get within the 2 meters, but again, no prolonged or deliberate contact. And really, like when it will be completely safe is when we don't have any local transmission. So for example, in New Zealand, they were able to get to 0 cases of COVID They still have some now, but so far I believe they've all been from returning travelers and they've all been safely quarantined. So if we get to that point where we're no longer getting any community transmission of cases, then yeah, it'll be safe to be close because there won't be risk of transmission in the community. But it's really hard to say when it'll be. A lot of countries that had peaks earlier than us are getting a second wave. So we're hoping that we won't have that. But if we do, then we may be stuck in something closer to stage 2 for longer. This was 2 questions, but they were quite similar. It was, is it safe to exercise with a mask on? And what are your views on using a face shield or mask? So I'll answer the second one first. And this is something that was confusing because at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone was saying, you know, don't wear a mask. Masks are just for healthcare providers. They don't really help. And then as we got more information, we realized that actually masks are quite useful and they don't really protect the person wearing the mask. Masks really help with everyone else. So this virus, it can't travel on its own. It travels in droplets that come out of your nose or mouth. And those droplets move like from your breath or from sneezing or coughing or singing. So they come out in whatever direction your nose and mouth are facing. So if you have a mask on, it'll stop some of those droplets and it gets in the way of that force from your mouth or nose that's pushing them out towards everyone around you. So if everyone's wearing a mask, then there's much less transmission of that. The reason the mask doesn't protect you so well, especially a cloth mask, is it's not perfect, so some droplets can get through. And even if it fits well, some droplets could get in around the mask on the sides or in the top. And the virus can also infect through the eyes, so masks don't protect the eyes. So face shields would be more to protect yourself if you're wearing one, because it blocks your eyes and it also protects your mask. So nothing can get into your eyes when you're wearing a face shield. And if someone does get close to you and you get droplets on your mask, and if you forget to only remove it by the straps and you accidentally touch it, then if you're wearing a face shield, you won't have any droplets on your mask that you're transferring to your hand. So in medical clinics or healthcare facilities, generally we're wearing masks and face shields for maximum protection. I will say though, face shields are very hot. They're not that comfortable. So if you want to protect yourself, you can wear a mask and a face shield, but you might find it quite uncomfortable, especially if you're exerting yourself as well. The face shield, though, it's not a substitute for the mask. So most face shields, if you've seen people wearing them, they come a little bit forward, and a lot of people tilt them up because they fog up and they get hot. So if you're talking and you're wearing a face mask, or you're just wearing a face shield but no mask, all the droplets can go forward and down. So if you're standing up and someone's sitting down, your droplets can still get to them. I see a lot in restaurants, people are wearing face shield but no mask and carrying food, and the droplets basically have a direct path there. So it's not a substitute. It's a possible addition if you want to protect yourself, but the mask really protects others. And in terms of, is it safe to exercise? The answer is yes. I would say the only time it wouldn't be safe is if the mask doesn't fit well. So sometimes it'll ride up and block your vision. That's not safe if you might get hit or you don't have any peripheral vision. And also if it doesn't fit well and you're fidgeting with it or touching it a lot, then it kind of defeats the purpose because you're spreading your droplets and touching everything. So it should fit well and be comfortable. And you may have seen one of these pictures at least. So on the left, that's Galen Rupp, and he won the 10,000 meter at US Nationals in 2011. And you can see he's wearing a mask. And the reason he's wearing the mask is he has asthma and he's very sensitive to pollen. And there was a high pollen count on the day of the race. So he was actually wearing his mask to enhance performance and to make him feel better with his asthma. I think I read that he did take it off at some point close to the end of the race, but he had no problem running 10,000 meters and he won. And on the right, that's the Delhi half marathon in 2017. And a lot of people were wearing masks because of high levels of air pollution. So, it was to protect themselves from the pollution and the smog in the air. So it is safe. It doesn't drop your oxygen saturation, but it does take some getting used to. So if you have people who are anxious or they really can't tolerate it, you can gradually progress. You can wear it at home when you're relaxed. You can increase the duration. So it is safe. But we're not necessarily recommending it because it can be uncomfortable or hot. And in areas where the masks are mandated, like for example in Toronto, there is an exception that if you're exercising, you can take it off. So if you feel great exercising with a mask, that's fine, no problem. If you really don't want to wear it, that's okay, but you'd want to make sure that you're maintaining your distancing. All right, and this is an interesting question I've heard from lots of people as well. So some facilities in my region have more than 10 people in the gym at the same time. Is there a social distancing rule that I'm not aware of? We have a large facility and can facilitate more athletes at one time while still maintaining the social distancing rules. And this came up on the last webinar about does the limit apply to sport or not? We're still trying to get an answer to that question. So in stage 2, the legislation said that the gathering limit doesn't apply to businesses. So for example, a grocery store, you're allowed more than 10 people if it's large enough to distance. So that could be interpreted that if you have a facility that's large and allows for distancing, then that would be okay if you had more than 10. I would say, though, if you have a training group, that could be considered a gathering. So you would want to stick to the gathering limits there. It's much less of an issue in stage 3 because the gathering limit goes up so much. So most sports, I don't think would be training with more than 50 people at the same time. So if you're in an area going into stage 3 at midnight tonight, then that makes it a lot easier. As long as you can maintain the distancing. Okay, and more questions on physical distancing. These are another 2 similar questions. So how does the physical distancing affect combat sports? And how does physical contact compare to physical distancing in the context of a sport like fencing? So again, stage 2, physical distancing has to be maintained. And then for stage 3, the advice is still to maintain distancing as much as possible, but with those exceptions that I talked about. So you can't have prolonged or deliberate contact. And the exceptions to the contact rule would be if it's necessary for teaching or instruction, if you need it for personal training, or if you're playing a team sport. But in that case, again, it still says you have to avoid contact. So you can get closer, but you can't have contact. So fencing is a bit tough because you don't necessarily have body-to-body contact, but you do get quite close. And we're trying to clarify that as well. But I would say, if you're not sure, I would review the legislation, check if your NSO has guidelines, and interpret it as best you can. As far as we know, this isn't being policed, but you have to use your best judgment and try to mitigate the risk as best as possible. All right, and this question, this is a very good question as well. What steps should a sport put in place if someone in a training group develops symptoms of COVID-19 or the common cold or tests positive for COVID-19? So the first step is to have a protocol in place and make sure everyone knows about it, or at least knows that there is a protocol, and they should ask someone about it if they're not sure. And as I said before, make sure everyone knows not to come if they have any symptoms. You really don't want them to show up and expose other people. And you want to follow the public health guidelines. These have changed every few weeks ever since the pandemic started. So currently in Ontario, if anyone has any symptoms, and there's a whole list, but it includes things like fever, cough, runny nose, stuffy nose, pink eye, abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, croup or barky cough, changes in taste or smell, any of those things, it's actually recommended they get a test. And as I mentioned before, it's quite easy. You find an assessment center, you go and get your test, you can log on online. Most of them are available within 24 to 48 hours, and public health will follow up with everyone. So regardless of symptoms, even if you think it's just a cold, you should not be in contact with anyone else, because as I had mentioned before, even if you just have a regular cold, you pass it on to someone else, they have to go through this whole process, and it just is a big headache for everyone. If you do have a positive test, public health will track down any contact and they'll give advice about isolation. Usually, if the test is positive, it would be 14 days isolation from the time of the positive test. And public health will go over each exposure. So in a training group, if you have been close together, like less than 2 meters for 15 minutes or more, then everyone would be considered exposed. And if you're not sure, really the safest thing to do is to isolate everyone for 14 days. And if no one gets symptoms, then you can be cleared. And if someone does have symptoms, they should get a test. If you've been really careful about distancing and wearing masks and everything's been outside, and you've spoken to public health and they're comfortable that no one else has been exposed, then you could follow their advice. But if you're erring on the side of caution, quarantining everyone for 14 days is the safest. And again, if the test is negative and you have any symptoms, you want to wait till they're totally gone and then another 24 hours to make sure. And that was all the questions that came through. So I hope this was helpful. If there's any follow-up questions or clarification, I'll do my best to answer. And if anyone has any great tips that they've been doing that they want to share with others, that would be helpful as well.
Great, thank you very much, Sari. There was one question from Christina Hahn. I'm not sure if the question around fencing has answered that for her, so I will turn it over to Christina if she would like to open her mic and ask that question.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you both for hosting this and giving us the opportunity to ask these clarification questions. So I think you've clarified most of what we have. We have concerns about, whether going from or whether following the 2-meter physical distancing regulations in Section 8 of Schedule 2 and 36420, or whether there's that exception in Schedule 1, Section 5. Now, with fencing, unfortunately, if we're doing a coach versus athlete situation, we're constantly breaking that 2-meter distance. And so we're also trying to kind of err on the side of caution and see whether the instructional personal training exception and exemption does apply in that situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I don't know the definite answer. I didn't write the legislation. My interpretation of it was that would fall in the category, but it's probably not in the spirit of the recommendation if you have to be close for prolonged periods, because again, there was that caveat about prolonged or deliberate contact. Like if you have to get close to correct technique or to spot someone in the gym or to help someone if they're going to get injured, that would be one thing. But if you're in that constant contact, then that would be considered close contact if it's more than 15 minutes at less than 2 meters. That's usually what public health uses. And they had specified judo and wrestling. Fencing's not quite the same, but it is that prolonged close contact. So I think the safest would be to not have that prolonged contact. But that would be something also to check with the NSO, because I believe fencing did have, they had quite a thorough document, more on a position statement. It came out a couple months ago, so they might be working on an update. But
I'm actually part of the team.
Are you? Oh, perfect. Oh, okay, great. So
Ontario Fencing has actually a medical and health committee that we have experts on the panel for, and our NSO actually also is taking sort of our document and modifying it. So unfortunately, it's kind of the other
expert.
And we have amazing individuals on that committee, but this is where we're stuck of how do we be cautious, but also allow fencing as a combat sport to function as a combat sport going forward.
Yeah, that, like I said, I don't have a definite answer. I mean, there might be ways you can get creative with that, with teaching. But I mean, it may be something, in the next stage or as things open up a bit more that would be addressed. But yeah, that prolonged close contact would probably be considered higher risk.
Thank you. I actually did have a follow-up question. I know the INS in Quebec has allowed certain sports and certain athletes to sort of function and train in a setting that is exempt from the 2-meter regulation. I think it's 1.8 in Quebec. Is the CSIO kind of pursuing a similar trajectory to allow some of our Olympic hopefuls to sort of train in that situation?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I just found out, I sat in on our the last webinar that Dr. Steve Dilkis, who's currently at the CSIO, did. And he said that, yes, they are looking at whether they can grant an exemption for anyone training for the upcoming Olympics or Paralympics. So I think that's TBD. Some of the CSIO people might know more about that than I do. But yes, we're trying to pursue that, and also, again, to just get clarification about the legislation. We were working on all the stage 2 legislation. All of a sudden, we have a whole new document to look at for stage 3.
That is fantastic potential news. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sari. Sariada, if you can see your chat there, there's a couple of questions for you that starting with Cam Stephen.
Oh, okay, yes. Recommendations for teams on whether we need to maintain contact tracing. Yeah, so contact tracing, I would say that public health does that, but keeping attendance and knowing who is at your facility and who's had contact with each other is extremely helpful, so that if anyone does test positive, you can figure out exactly who is at risk. So again, we don't have any recommended software or a specific way, but you should be taking attendance and knowing what times everyone was together at your facility, and ideally also documenting somewhere that they have been screened, so you know that no one had symptoms on that day. And then if anyone does test positive, you can look back in your records and contact anyone who needs to be notified and sent for testing. Public health does do that, but if you have a list, it helps a lot and makes their job a lot faster. I hope that answers the question. If not, I can try to clarify. And I saw the next question. I would like clarification on diving boards. Cleaning guidelines state after each use. Does this mean per person or per practice? That's a great question. And it's not clarified in the legislation or in the documents. Yeah, that would be something if you had heard anything from the sport ministry, or pools are generally regulated by public health as well, so they might have more specific recommendations. More recently, when the legislation had talked about cleaning equipment, the question about balls came up. If you're playing basketball, obviously you're not going to clean the ball every time someone touches it, then you can't play. So, I would say, like, reasonably, it's probably between each session, but I didn't write the legislation. It would be subject to interpretation. Can you clean the board in between each person? Probably, but I think that would be very impractical. And especially if you have the same training group, then you have similar exposure. So my interpretation would be after each session, but that's just based on me reading that and not based on any legal advice or opinions. Okay, and another question, would it be acceptable to hold kicking targets? So yeah, again, that depends a bit. a leg is not quite 2 meters unless you're really, really tall. So you would be kind of close. So you wouldn't really be maintaining that 2 meter distancing. If you're doing it once or twice, again, for instruction purposes, that would be lower risk. If you're holding a kicking target over and over again, and it's getting into that more than 15 minutes, and you're facing in the same direction, then we'd be at that kind of higher risk of transmission.
What if you're moving like up and down, like holding the target?
Yeah, I mean, that would be one of the things that's kind of subject to interpretation of the guidelines or of the legislation. They don't specifically mention that. Yeah, I think you'd have to kind of do your own risk assessment. Again, if your NSO has any recommendations about that, it would be helpful. And, hopefully if we can get exemptions for at least training at CSIO for those Olympic and Paralympic hopefuls, then that should be something that would be allowed if we get that exemption. But if there's any other way to do it where you can maintain 2 meters apart, that would be better.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks, Dr. Sari. I don't see any other questions at the moment. We'll just give it a few seconds here. If anybody has a question, please pop it into that that chat box. In the meantime, I'm going to share a closing screen that has a link to some various other links to documents, our resource hub at CSIO, that we're able to direct you to some of the previous sessions that we've hosted to date that will hopefully help answer a few more questions. But as mentioned on previous webinars here, it's a fairly dynamic situation. Things are moving quickly, and some of this information may in fact be out of date now. So, Dr. Sari, I can't see my chat box now, so if anything comes up, please feel free to address it.
I don't see any new ones.
Okay, great. Well, I will start closing up. Dr. Sari Kraft, thank you very much for taking the time today. Really do appreciate it. There's a lot of work that has gone into reading the legislation as it continues to change, so we do appreciate that. We know that the work that you and our other physicians are doing to try and ensure a speedy return, but safe return to sport is much appreciated by the sports sector. So thank you very much on behalf of CSIO, and if there are any further questions, please feel free to forward them to us. We will take care of those, and we will try and get as many answers as we can. As Dr. Sari has mentioned, we are constantly speaking with the ministry to try and clarify certain issues. So we will get to that, and keep an eye on the resource hub as we populate that with information as well. So thank you everybody for attending today. Take care.